The valve lineup moves free in the bore. Now once you're sure they're all free, then let's move on to the forward accumulator. Replace the D-ring on the piston with a new one from the kit, working it around the piston. Then install the guide pin. Now lube the piston and slide it in the bore. Next, insert the low overrun valve, making sure it moves freely in its bore. Install the large spring on the piston and the small spring on the valve. Install the cover and the retaining bolts, torquing them down 95 to 100 inch-pounds. Next, install the 1-2 shift valve spring. Then install the 1-2 shift valve. Next, replace the O-ring on the snout of both shift solenoids A and B. Install the solenoid. Remember to lube the O-ring. Holding the solenoid down against the spring pressure, install the spring clip. Next, install the 2-3 shift valve. Then the 2-3 shuttle valve. Install shift solenoid B. Remember to lube the O-ring. Then insert the spring clip. Next is the replacement of the force motor. Now if you want to spice up the shifts a little, then you will need to make an adjustment. Towards the back of the force motor, between the two electrical spades, is a tiny screw. Using a Torx bit, screw it in clockwise about 1/4 of a turn. The more you screw it in, the higher the internal pressures will be. The result will be firmer shifts. And never screw it in past a full turn. Want stock shifts? Then don't touch the screw. Just install it like it is new. Notice the design of the retainer. Here and here, and the way it installs on the force motor. Notice the cutout in the base of the force motor. This part of the retainer fits next to the cutout. Next, install the hold down screw, torque it down 95 to 100 inch-pounds, and notice the position of the electrical spades. Properly installed, this is what it looks like. If your transmission uses the 95 and later 2-3 control valve and spring, then first install the spring, then the valve. Next, install the 2-3 control solenoid and notice the position of the connector. Install the spring clip. Don't forget to install the manual valve. Once you're finished with the valve body and you're satisfied that all the valves move freely, then put it in a plastic bag to keep it clean and set it off to the side. Now let's move on to the next subsection and let's rebuild the pump assembly. First, remove the old bonding material left from the old seal. Now be careful here and use only light strokes. You only need to scrape away the adhesive and not the aluminum casting. Next, let's remove that pump bushing. Now be sure to use the correct size bushing driver. Drive it out through the pump in this direction only. Once you have the old pump bushing removed, let's replace it with a new one. First, flip the pump body over and notice the reset area here. Next, find a bushing driver that will fit flush in the reset area. After you have found one that fits flush, set it off to the side. You will need it to set the pump bushing. Take the new bushing and using a high-strength Loctite, apply it to the outside area of the new bushing. Then using the correct size bushing driver that fits the bushing, drive it in to where it rests just above the reset area. Then using the driver that fitted the reset area before, drive the bushing flush. And then wipe off the excess Loctite. And when correctly done, this is what it should look like. Now it's time to install your front seal. But first, let's make sure the garter spring is in place. You don't want any front seal leaks. Apply Loctite to the outer edge of the seal that contacts the pump surface. Then install the seal. Now make sure you drive the front seal all the way down, making a good tight seal to the pump. Next, if your transmission had one, install the seal retainer. The 4 retainer clips installs in these locations only. Next, install the pump slide seal and a new O-ring. First, replace the O-ring and then the metal seal. Paste the seal to the pump slide using your petroleum jelly or trans gel. To install the slide in the pump body, you will need to locate the pivot pin hole and the pocket where the 2 slide springs go. Then set the pump slide in the pump body, as I have did here. Next, you'll need to install the slide seal support and slide seal. First, install the rubber seal support and then the Teflon seal. Next, install that tiny spring and the pivot pin in this hole located here. First, install the spring, then install the pivot pin. Next is the 2 pump slide springs. Now slide the smaller spring into the larger spring. Using a flat edged screwdriver, install them together into the pump body, between the slide's lever and the pump's casting. Now this step is not easy. Sometimes this can be very difficult, so take your time. These springs are tough. Next, take one of the 2 vane rings and lay it in the pump body. Then take the rotor and rotor guide and notice the lugs on the rotor guide. Insert the rotor guide on the rotor matching the lugs on the guide to the slots in the rotor. Notice on the guide the ledge located here. It installs in the recess you use to set the pump bushing with. Then insert the rotor into the pump body. You may need to paste the rotor guide to the rotor using your transgel. Next, install the pump vanes. Now look closely and you'll notice two witness marks on the edge of each vane. When installing the vanes, they set next to the pump vane rings. When you have finished installing all the vanes, then install the last ring. The rings keep the vanes tight against the pump slide. Now let's work on the stator half of the pump, or the pump cover. First, make sure the pressure regulator valve moves free, just like you did on the valve body. Also, make sure the converter clutch valve is free in its bore. If you need to remove the valve lineup, they can be serviced by removing the snap ring located on each side of the filter seal. Next, replace the filter seal. Remove the old seal the same way you did on the front and rear seal. Be careful and do not scratch or gouge the seal bore. Install the new seal either with an old socket or a bushing driver that will set flush on top of the seal. And simply drive the seal into place until it rests flush to the surface of the stator casting. Now back to the pump. You will need to lube all the rotating parts, the ingredients that make up the pump. 80-90 gear oil works great for this. To set the stator on the pump body, first you will need to locate where the pivot pin meets the stator half. It's located in line with the pump screen. Then set the stator in through the pump, lining the pivot pin in line with the pump screen. Now this is where that hole in the bench comes in handy again. Next, install all the bolts, but do not tighten them yet. For the next step, you will need the pump alignment band. Install the alignment band as I have done here, making sure the band covers where the pump and stator separates. After you have tightened the band around the pump, then tighten and torque all bolts down 18 to 25 foot-pounds. Next, install a new pump O-ring, installing it in this groove here. Looking at the pump O-ring closer, you'll notice a paint stripe. When the O-ring is installed on the pump, this painted stripe should be showing. Then install a new pump screen. Now don't forget to fit it with a new O-ring. Now lube the O-ring and push the screen into this bore. Push it in till it stops. Replace the two stator rings. To replace them, you will need this special tool set up. One piece spreads the Teflon rings over the stator shaft, while the other is a resizing tool to resize the rings once you have them on the stator. First, remove the O-rings. Then place the tool on the shaft. Screw it down till the first ring lands or showing. Then spread the new ring over the tool until it rests in the groove. Then screw the tool up to the next ring land. Then install the next Teflon ring. Remove the tool and resize the rings as best as possible with your fingers. Then lube both the resizing tool and the rings and simply resize the rings. Now leave the tool on the stator shaft till we install the pump assembly back into the transmission case. Now let's move on to the input sprag. The first thing you'll need to do is cross-hatch the outer and inner races where the sprag element rides. Use 80 grit sandpaper and lightly sand the races. What you're trying to do here is knock off the glaze look and give the surface a rough look. Then install one of the retainer rings. Then set the sprag element over the inner race. Install the element with the cage windows located here on the right side. If you install the sprag with the windows on the left side, the result will be a no movement condition when you shift the transmission into drive. Next, take the outer race and find the reset area located here. Set the race on the bench with this reset area down. Now taking the assembly you just built, flip it over and set it on the outer race. Working the sprag's levers, fold them over. Fold them over until the sprag slides into the outer race. Now turn the assembly over and install the other retainer ring. Then install the hub, spin it until it lugs into the inner race. Next, install the snap ring. When you're finished, make sure the sprag rotates in the right direction. Holding the outer race, the hub should rotate clockwise only. And that's it for the input sprag. Now let's put together that input drum. To start, turn the drum over, input shaft down. Now that hole in the bench comes in handy here. Then install a new O-ring around the drum tower. Using our demonstration drum, that groove is located here around the drum tower. Next, lube the outside and inside lip edges of the 3/4 molded piston. If your 3/4 piston is an aluminum type, then you will need to replace the lip seals first. We will get more into the replacement of lip seals on the Ford piston, since this transmission uses a 3/4 molded piston. Now lube the area in the drum where the piston lip seals ride. Then install the piston. Using a lip seal installation tool or a filler gauge, work the outer lip seal, fold it down between the drum and piston. Now be careful here and don't cut or tear the seal. Now chase the lip seal around the piston until the piston freely drops into the drum. Next, install the Ford piston. If the piston is a molded type, then skip the next step. If it is an aluminum type, then you will need to replace those lip seals. Now notice how the seals installs on the piston and the direction of the lip part of the seal. The lips of the seal must face down when installing the piston into the drum. Next, lube both lip seals. Now take the Ford clutch housing and set the piston into the housing. Use your thumbnail and work the outer seal until the piston slides into the housing. Next, set the 3/4 clutch spring assembly into the 3/4 clutch apply ring. Then take both the housing and Ford piston as an assembly and set it on top of the spring cage. Next, you will need to position the lugs of the piston to the apply ring, just like I have done here. Then lube the forward clutch housing where it contacts the O-ring on the drum tower and the inner lip seal on the 3/4 piston. Next, drop the whole assembly into the drum. Notice the position of the fingers on the 3/4 apply ring and the lugs on the forward piston, and the way they set in the drum. Now you will need to chase that inner lip seal on the forward piston around the drum tower. Work the seal, fold it down until the piston slides over the tower. Do not force the piston down. Work the lip seal until the piston moves down in the bore without restriction. Next, install the overrun piston. If it is an aluminum type, then you will need to replace those lip seals. Now install the piston into the drum. Now you will need to chase both inner and outer lip seals. Work them down until the piston drops over the tower and into the cavity of the forward piston. And remember, do not force the piston. Take your time on this. You don't want to damage those new seals. Next, install the return spring assembly. Now set the opened end of the springs over the stools located on the overrun piston. On models with molded pistons, the return spring will be closed on both ends, and the piston will not have the stools. Then compress the return spring with the universal spring compressor. Next, install the snap ring. Now it's time to insert those frictions and steel plates. First, start with an overrun steel and then an overrun friction plate. Install a second steel and a second friction plate. Then install the apply plate. On top of the apply plate, install the wave plate. Next is a flat steel and a forward clutch. Then alternate your steels and clutch plates. Install the input shaft to output shaft lube seal, spreading lube over the seal. Install the Torrington bearing with the inner race facing down. Then install that input sprag. You will need to spline the overrun and forward clutch plates to the hub and outer race of the sprag assembly. If you're having a problem with this, try using a pair of snap ring pliers. They work great for this. You'll know it's all the way down when the inner race lays against the top of the Torrington bearing. Next, install the forward clutch pressure plate with the beveled side facing up, then the snap ring. After the snap ring is in place, you'll need to check that clutch pack clearance. Using a filler gauge, slide it between the snap ring and pressure plate. To adjust this clearance, you will need to change the pressure plate. It is selective. Next, install the 3/4 apply plate. Now install the legs of the plate over the fingers of the 3/4 clutch apply ring. Install a friction plate and then a steel plate. Notice the small and big teeth on the steel plate. The small teeth slide in this groove notched here in the input drum housing. Then alternate clutch and steel. After you have installed all the friction and steel plates, then install the 5 3/4 load springs. Now slide the springs in between the small teeth with the open end of the spring cage facing up. Then install the 3/4 pressure plate with the bevel side up. Install the snap ring. Now to measure the 3/4 clutch pack clearance, slide the gauge between the pressure plate and the top friction plate. This pressure plate is also selective and used to gain proper clutch pack clearance. Now let's air check those clutch packs using compressed air. You'll need to push air through these 3 holes between the sealing rings. Using a rubber tip on the blowgun, air check the 3/4 clutch pack. You want to hear a good solid thud when you hit this passage with air as the piston travels up the drum and tightens the 3/4 clutch pack. Next, use your thumb and cover the middle hole, then air check the overrun clutch pack, removing your thumb to allow the air to escape. Remember, you're looking for a good solid thud as the clutch pack tightens. Then air check the forward clutch pack. Releasing the trigger on the blowgun, the air should flow backwards through this same passage as the return spring moves the piston back. Replace all the Teflon sealing rings. Use a pick and remove the rings. You will need this special tool set to install and resize the turbine shaft rings. Using the expander side of this tool set, screw it down to the first ringland. Expand one of the sealing rings over the tool down to the first land. Now screw the tool up to the next ringland and install the next ring, and do so until the last ring is installed on the input shaft. Next, resize the rings with your fingers as close as possible to the input shaft. Next, lube all the rings with Vaseline or Transgel. Using the resizing tool, gently push it down over the input shaft and resize the rings. Now leave the resizing tool on the turbine shaft for now to help set the rings. And let's move on to the final and last subsection, the reverse input drum. First, lightly sand the drum where the 2/4 band rides. Use 80 grit sandpaper and cross hatch the drum until you break the glaze, giving it a rough look. Next, replace the lip seals on the piston. Just like the pistons on the main input drum, the lip part of the seal always faces down into the drum. Save the old seals, you may need them. This piston is not easy to install, especially if you're doing this for the first time. Now, since this is a difficult piston to install, lube both the inner and outer lip seals with either Transgel or Vaseline. Also, let's lube the inside of the drum where the seals ride. Install the piston, work both inner and outer seals, folding the lip part of the seal down between the piston and the drum. This piston does fit tight in the drum and can be a little fussy going down, so take your time with this and don't cut those new seals. If you do damage your new seals, you can always use the old ones as long as they're in good shape. And remember, never force the piston down. Next, install the return spring and the snap ring using the universal spring compressor. Now don't confuse the low and reverse snap ring for the reverse input drum snap ring. They do look similar, but they're not. The reverse input drum snap ring is thicker, and the low and reverse snap ring is the thinner one. Next, install the cushion plate, cone side faces up. Then install a flat steel and alternate between frictions and steels. Install the pressure plate, beveled side up, then the snap ring. To check the clearance, slide the gauge between the snap ring and the pressure plate. To adjust the clearance, change the pressure plate. Technically, it's called the backing plate. Now turn the drum over and let's air check that clutch pack. Push air through this hole located here. The hole may be square or round. Remember, you're looking for a good solid thud as the piston tightens the clutch pack. Now let's install the reverse input drum over the main input drum. Remove the seal resizer. Install the total in-play thrust washer. Then install the Torrington bearing. Inner race facing up. Outer race facing down. You will need to spline the clutch plates in the reverse drum to the splines here around the input drum. Be careful not to damage those new turbine shaft rings. Install the reverse drum over the shaft, lining the friction plates to the input drum. You'll know it's all the way down when the reverse drum rests on the Torrington bearing. Now that we are finished with all the subsections, let's reinstall them in the transmission case. Going to the rear of the case, let's replace that case bushing. First, knock out the old bushing. Install a new case bushing on a driver that fits the bushing. Now going through the pump side of the transmission case, insert both the bushing and the driver. Drive the bushing down into the transmission case. Now drive it down just below this chamfered edge. Next, replace the 3 square cut O-rings on the lone reverse piston. Notice the lug located here on the back side of the piston. This lug sets in the reset area here in the bottom of the transmission case. Install the lone reverse piston, lining up the lug to the reset area in the case. To help install the piston, use the top ring gear and hub assembly as a tool and set it on top of the piston. Using a butt of a hammer, lightly strike the top of the hub, moving the piston down into the case. Next, install the return spring and the snap ring. Using the universal spring compressor. Next, install the Torrington bearing on the bottom ring gear hub with the outer race facing up, and the inner race lays against the hub. Then install the Torrington bearing that fits on the bottom planetary, outer race up. The inner race lays against the base of the planetary. You will also need to paste this Torrington bearing on the bottom of the planetary. Then install the bottom ring gear into the transmission case. Next, install the bottom planetary into the ring gear, lining the teeth on the planetary gear to the teeth on the ring gear. Now to install the lone reverse clutch pack. Start with a wavy steel. Look for the identification V-notch cut in one of the lugs. You will also find this identification V-notch on all of the steels. Install the wave steel first, with the V-notch facing towards the valve body section and bottom pan. Then install a flat steel. If one of the steels is thicker than the rest of the steels, it installs against the wave plate. Then install a friction plate or clutch plate, lining up the teeth on the friction plates to the bottom planetary, and alternate between steels and clutches. And you should end up with a friction plate on top. Next, let's reinstall the anti-clunk spring. Now the spring sets in this pocket here between the clutch pack and the case. Use Trans-Gel or Vaseline and paste the spring in place. This is the way the spring positions itself in the case. Once you have the spring in place, install the lone reverse sprag and support assembly. Notice the area in the support that has no lugs. This cutout sets in the case located here. Next, install the support and sprag assembly into the case. Now gently push the support down until the anti-clunk spring snaps into place between the support and the transmission case. Rotate the inner race clockwise until it falls into place to the lugs on the bottom planetary. And when you have the support settled into the case, this is what it should look like when it's properly installed. Then install the snap ring. Now place the ends of the snap ring on the outside of the anti-clunk spring and this lug. Next, install the rear sun gear, splining the gear teeth to the bottom planetary gears. Install the black 4-tang washer with the 4 tabs facing down against the lone reverse sprags in a race. Next, install the sun gear shell. The splines located here fits over the rear sun gear. Install the metal 4-tang thrust washer, fitting the tabs of the washer to the 4 holes in the sun shell. Late model 4L60E transmissions will not have the metal washer, but a Torrington bearing that snaps to the top ring gear hub. Next, install the top ring gear and hub assembly. Set the Torrington bearing on the top planetary. Inner race facing towards the planet body. Outer race faces towards the top hub. Then insert the planetary into the ring gear. Now it's time to install that output shaft. Holding the gear set in place, slide the shaft through the rear of the transmission and up through the gear set. Then install the output shaft snap ring. Once you have the output shaft set, install the top sun gear with these splines facing away from the planetary gears. Skip this step if you're working on a model with the sun gear mounted to the input sprag. Now give those planetaries a small spin. They should rotate and spin freely without any bind-ups. Next, install the reverse and main input drum assembly. You will need to align the 3/4 clutch plates to the top ring gear, the reverse drum to the sun shell, and the input sprag to the sun gear, or the sun gear to the top planetary, depending on which style and year unit you're working on. You will know it's all the way down and seated properly when you can move the input drum up and down against the sun gear and the reverse input drum. Listen for a solid metal sound as you're moving the drum up and down. The reverse drum will drop about 1/16 to 3/8 of an inch below the deck where the pump mates to the case. Next, install a new 2/4 band. Notice the pilot hole for the anchor pin and the indention in the strap where the 2/4 servo pin applies the band. Now when installing the band, be careful not to damage the braking material bonded to the band's surface area. Use a screwdriver and work the band around the drum. Next, insert the anchor pin. The small side of the pin fits through the case first and anchors the band. You will need to locate and set the pilot end of the band to the anchor pin hole in the case. Once you have the band set, slide the pin through the valve body side of the case and anchor the 2/4 band to the transmission case. Going back to the pump, remove the resizing tool. Next, install the pump to reverse drum plastic thrust washer. Notice on the back side of the washer the two legs. The two legs of the washer fit into the two holes located here. Using Transgel, paste the washer to the support. Next, using your 80-90 gear oil, lube the pump O-ring and stator rings, and the inside of the stator where the input shaft rings will ride. Lube the inside cylinder of the reverse drum to help ease the installation of those sealing rings. Lube the cavity of the case where the pump O-ring sets. Next, set the pump gasket in the case. Notice the flap here designed into the pump gasket. Now this flap is there to guard transmission fluid from splashing out of the breather cavity and out through the vent tube. Looking into the transmission case with the valve body side facing down, the flap in the gasket lays at the 11 o'clock position. Now set two of your guide pins into two of the pump bolt holes. It doesn't matter which holes, as long as the guide pins are across from each other. Then gently set the pump over the input shaft and into the pump cavity of the case, aligning the filter seal with the hole through the valve body side of the case. Now using your fist, ease the pump assembly down. Stop just before the pump O-ring enters into the case. Once you're sure that all 6 sealing rings have started into the cylinder of the reverse drum and the stator bore, then use a butt of a hammer and take the pump the rest of the way down, compressing the pump O-ring between the pump body and case. Then wipe off the excess oil. Then install all new O-rings on the pump bolts. Tighten and torque all the pump to case bolts to 18 foot-pounds. To check the total in-play setting, use a pair of vice grips and clamp them on the input shaft. Set the jaws of the pliers against the end of the stator and move the input shaft up and down. This is your total in-play. To measure that clearance, use a filler gauge and pick up on the input shaft. Slide the gauge in between the stator and the vice grips. Next, install the 2/4 servo assembly. Replace the O-ring on the inner housing. Most manufacturers will have them color-coded. The popular colors for the inner housing is either red or green. Install a new O-ring on the cover. Popular color is blue. Replace the scarf-cut Teflon sealing ring on the 4th apply piston. Notice how the two ends of the sealing ring butt together. Replace the 2 Teflon rings on the 2nd apply piston, ensuring the ends are set the same as on the 4th apply piston. Next, install the return spring. Then slide the inner housing over the 2nd apply piston with the webbing of the inner housing facing away from the 2nd apply piston. Lube the sealing ring and the inside of the bore. Insert the assembly into the bore. Next, install the 4th apply piston. Notice the tall and short stools on either side of the piston. The tall stool faces the inside of the servo cover. Insert both the piston and the cover as an assembly. Remember to first lube the O-ring. Tap the cover into the case. Then install that snap ring. The 2/4 servo is preset at the factory. However, the servo can be adjusted by using different pin lengths. The different pin lengths can be identified by grooves lathed into the tip of the pin. You can check the stroke of the servo by using your existing servo cover. Another good way is to use an old cover. Knocking the center out of it will give you a better view of the stroke of the servo pin. Either way, when you use this method, do not use the cover O-ring. Install the cover without the O-ring. Now, using your existing cover, install the cover with the snap ring in place. Using a screwdriver, push down on the center of the cover using the snap ring groove. Using our custom cover, retain it in place with the snap ring and simply push down on the end of the servo pin. You're looking for a travel anywhere from 3/8 to 1/4 of an inch. Next, air check the servo by pushing air through this hole. About 40 to 50 psi works just fine. You can view the band's operation through this window just below the filter seal in the pump area. Each time the servo is hit with air, the band should tighten around the reverse drum. And now let's go to the bottom of the transmission and air check the low and reverse clutch pack through this hole. You can watch the clutch pack's movement through this window located just above the apply hole. This doesn't require much air either. About the same you used on the servo, 40 to 50 psi. Next, install the park rod bracket. The park rod lays between the parking pole and case. Slide the park rod through the bracket. Make sure the parking pole sets on this side of the rod. Install the 2 bolts and torque them to 23 foot-pounds. As an update to the unit, remove this steel 1/4-inch check ball. Removing the ball will help to exhaust the fluid from the low and reverse clutch pack when the gear selector is moved from reverse to drive. To remove the ball, simply bend back these 2 tabs in the orifice. Do not remove the orifice, leave it in the case. Next, let's rebuild the 4th accumulator. Replace the D-ring on the piston. Insert the guide pin. Lube and insert the piston, the legs of the piston, towards the valve body. Install the spring. And last, install the 1/4-inch steel check ball into the sink located just above the 4th accumulator bore. Next, replace the 2 solenoid screens. And notice on which side of the plate they snap to. Install the case to spacer plate gasket. The 2 spacer plate gaskets are marked for identification. C for case and V for the valve body side of the plate. Set both gaskets one at a time on the plate and look for any covered holes. If you find any holes that are covered by the gasket, then you either have the wrong gasket or a faulty one. Set 2 guide pins in 2 of the valve body's bolt holes across from each other. After you set the case gasket in place, then set the spacer plate on top of the gasket. Set the valve body to plate gasket on top of the plate. Next, install the hold down plate and the 3 retaining bolts. Do not tighten them yet. Move the guide pins to these positions here. These 2 holes are the lineup holes for the 2 gaskets, the spacer plate, and the valve body. Once you have the gaskets and plate lined up, then tighten and torque the 3 hold-down plate screws to 96 inch-pounds. Notice the 2 identification letters, V and C. The 2 solenoid screens and their positions. Next, install the wiring harness. replace and lube the O-ring, and simply snap the harness into place. Install the manual valve link. Next, install the 7 1/4-inch steel check balls into these passages routed in the valve body. On installing the valve body to the case, you will need to turn the valve body over. In doing this, you will lose the 7 1/4-inch check balls. To prevent this from happening, pack the holes with Transgel or petroleum jelly, pasting the check balls in place. Now flip the valve body over and slide the manual valve link to the hole machined in the manual valve. Remove the 2 guide pins and install 2 valve body bolts in their place. Leave them loose to line up the valve body. Next, replace the O-ring on the snout of the lockup solenoid. Then install the lockup solenoid into the pump assembly. Clip the 2-3 control solenoid to the harness, the force motor to the harness, and then shift solenoid B, solenoid A. Then install all the valve body bolts, finger tight. Don't forget that dipstick guard. Install the 2 lockup solenoid bolts, torque them to 96 inch-pounds. Install the pressure manifold switch, leave the bolts finger tight. Connect it to the harness. Now torque the valve body bolts, as well as the ones that run through the pressure manifold switch. Torque them in 3 steps. First to 40 inch-pounds, then second to 65 inch-pounds, and the final torque to 96 inch-pounds. Torque them in a spiral pattern, starting in the center and working your way out. Next, let's rebuild the second accumulator. First, replace the D-ring on the piston. Install the big spring, then the small spring. Lube and install the piston with the legs of the piston facing towards the 2 springs. If you're working on an early model, then the piston and springs may be reversed. Install and torque the accumulator housing bolts to 96 inch-pounds. Install the detent lever. Torque the bolt to 100 inch-pounds. If your transmission uses a PWM TCC solenoid, install it now, connecting it to the harness. Install a new filter. Lay the pan gasket on the case. Install the bottom pan. Don't forget that magnet. Torque the pan bolts to 96 inch-pounds. Now flip the transmission over and replace the square cut O-ring on the extension housing. Install the extension housing and torque the bolts to 26 foot-pounds. Install a new rear seal. Next, install the VSS. Replace the O-ring. If your transmission uses a bolt-on bell housing, install it now. Next, replace the lockup O-ring on the end of the turbine shaft. The popular colors in use today is either black or green. Install a new dipstick seal, commonly called a hat seal. Next, replace the shaft lever seal. You may have to remove some outside linkage to access the seal. To service this seal, you will need this tool set. There are 2 styles in production today. A set for the early short shaft and a set for the late long shaft. This tool set consists of two pieces: the seal removal tool and the seal installation tool. At the end of the removal tool, you will notice tapered threads cut into the body of the tool, and at the other end, a bolt. Now screw this bolt out, except for about 5 to 10 threads. Then slide the tool over the shaft with the tapered threads facing the old seal. Tap at the end of the bolt while screwing the body of the tool clockwise. Then run the bolt up tight against the end of the shaft. Holding the body of the tool, pull the old seal out. Then clean the seal cavity. Install the new seal, working it around the shaft, taking care not to damage the rubber part of the seal. Now, using the installation side of this tool set the seal into the case. Then reinstall any part linkage. And that's it! You're finished! Oh, wait a minute, one more thing. Let's install the torque converter. I highly recommend that you purchase a new or a rebuilt converter when rebuilding this particular style of transmission. First, lube the lockup O-ring. Then charge the new torque converter with about 1/2 to a pint of transmission fluid. When installing the torque converter, you will need to spline the turbine shaft to the turbine in the converter, the stator splines to the stator in the converter, and the pump rotor to the slots machined in the hub on the converter. To check to see if it's all the way in, slide the converter all the way to the pump casting. You should not be able to slide your fingers between the bowl of the converter and the pan rail. And that's it! Now you're done! Except for the installation part. Before installing the transmission in the vehicle, do your valve body a favor and remove the trash from the trans cooling system. Using a catch container, push air through both cooler lines, removing the old fluid. After the fluid is exhausted from the cooling system, the air should move freely. If not, then the system is restricted and the radiator will need to be replaced. With the engine off, start with 6 quarts, use Dextron 3, and be good to your transmission. Use a high quality fluid. Then start the vehicle, add an additional 5 quarts, then check the fluid. Bring the fluid level just above the cross hatches edged in the dipstick. This will overfill the transmission about a pint, giving the rotating parts better lubrication. Do not overfill the transmission more than a pint. After you have achieved the correct level, clear any codes stored in the computer. Using proper jack stands, raise the rear wheels off the ground, hit the brakes, then move the selector to reverse, release the brakes, then lightly mash on the gas pedal. The rear wheels should move in reverse. Let them turn for about 45 seconds. Do not turn the wheels any faster than 10 miles per hour while in the reverse position. Before moving into the drive position, completely stop the wheels from turning. Never move from reverse to forward or vice versa while the wheels are turning. This is one good way to strip or snap the spline collar on that sun shell. Moving the selector to drive, the wheels should move in a forward direction. Let the transmission shift through all the gears. Bring the wheels to a stop and let the trans shift again. Do this several times. Then go for a road test. During the road test, you will need to check for lockup. Lightly tap the brake pedal just enough to turn on the brake lights. This is just before the brake system applies the brake pads to stop the vehicle. Looking at the tachometer, you should see and hear about a 200 RPM raise in engine speed. Release the pedal and you should get a drop in RPMs. If not, then lockup does not work and the transmission will not survive without it. Lockup must work. No lockup will end the transmission life quickly. Next, check for any leaks. Check the fluid and check for any codes. See, that wasn't all that hard, was it? I told you you could do it.